So what's so great about our two panelists today is that they have deep experience both at being CEO and then both have served on a number of boards. So we're thrilled to have Lynn Elsa-Hans, who has been CEO of Sunoco as well as Shell Oil, president of the organizations there, and has been on over, I think you said 6 public boards, Lynn. Currently on GlaxoSmithKline as well as Baker Hughes. And then we have Dwayne Radke, who is on the board of Devon and has also been CEO of a couple of companies, currently a company as well right now. And we got together at the end of December and just had a really robust conversation about this. And so we're looking forward to sharing all of this with you. So one of the things in the work that I do with CEOs and boards is you really get to see great leaders. I've been fortunate over the 20 plus years that I've been working with them that you see people that are extraordinary and then you see people that really struggle often with their boards. And so one of the things that I've noticed is regardless of industry that I've worked in or tenure of the CEO, those CEOs that really invest in open and candid conversations create this environment where they can drive results and create a lot of positive change. And I'd love to start by just talking about how does a board really create a strong, open, candid relationship with their CEO and the management team so you can get a level lower and understand what's going on in the organization. So I thought maybe, Dwayne, if you would mind start talking about Devon, the board that you're on, and some of the ways that you guys as a board get to know what's going on in the management committee and the company underneath.
Sure, I'd be glad to, and thank you for inviting me here. You know, when you look at boards and CEOs, how you assess a CEO, the relationship of the board to the CEO. There's a wide variety of ways that it's done. And, you know, you look at a lot of the papers and you look at best practices as to what is the best way to approach this. And you find that actually probably very few companies approach what might be the best practice. I think Devon certainly does that. You have to have a culture that begins at the top, and it certainly did with Larry Nichols when he founded the company, and then continued with John Rochelle's, and now with Dave Hager. And you have to have a confident CEO, because one of the things that we do that is different, it's certainly not unique. There's a few other companies that I think do it, but as part of our process, our annual process, when we're reviewing all the normal metrics you look at the end of the year when it comes to bonuses and strategic things that you were trying to accomplish, we actually spend a full day with interviews with the executive committee and the very senior management of Devon without the CEO or chairman being present. We then interview the CEO, and then we interview the chairman, non-executive chairman, in this particular case, and you visit with then, you know, all the key aspects, the chief operating officer, CFO, everybody, and you find out exactly how is if there was a transition, how's the transition going, how's the strategy going, how are the people, reduction in workforce, if you sold assets, how's that all being integrated, how are things working on the executive team. If it's a new CEO, how is he relating to the executive team? And you go through. And again, you have to be certainly somewhat careful in that type of a setting, because you don't want it to be, if you have a few people on the next level down, the executive committee, you don't want it to be a gripe session by any stretch of the imagination. You want some good input. But over a year or two, you find a way to filter through those comments, because if you hear the same comments, you understand it. So again, we then take what we hear, we have a conversation. This is done with the compensation committee, and fortunately for us, the lead director is also on the compensation committee. So we were able to review that. We then review with the non-executive chairman, and then we have some input also with the CEO. The actual feedback as we go through and process the end of the year, we take that into account. That's led actually by normally the lead director. So again, I think that's a good practice. It's a unique practice. And again, it's a cultural issue, and you have to have the CEO that's very confident and is not overly sensitive to any negative feedback that he might hear. So again, I think it's a good process. It's worked very well, certainly at Devon, and I think there might be, and Lynn might know of other companies or have worked with companies that have done that. But again, I think it's a very positive impact.
It is unusual. I haven't seen that in very many places where a CEO is that comfortable in having the board interviewed.
Right.
Lynn, you had talked a lot about doing deep dives and really understanding what employees are saying a level below the management committee. Do you want to talk a little bit about practices that you've seen on your boards to do that?
Sure. I think I'd start with, what are the worst practices, which is you get invited to a meeting and there's a slide deck about that high, and the management is absolutely determined to present every one of those slides, and there's absolutely no time for discussion. And so I think the first thing you do is you set the expectation that we're not going to have a presentation, we're going to have a conversation, and that conversation gets modeled in the boardroom between the board and the CEO and the other management that comes in. And then that same type of arrangement, I think, is really important for a board member to get out into the operations locations and into the field, so to speak, and have those same kind of conversations with, let's say, a plant manager and the plant manager's team, or go to a finance center or an accounting center and have at least a cross-section of employees, in the room. And again, kind of echoing what Dwayne said, you do have to have management that's got enough confidence to allow you to go out there and without them present, so to speak, and really hear from people who do the work, what it's like to work there, what their issues are, what they're concerned about, but also what they're proud about. And why they like working where they work. And I think my experience in doing this is that people like it when the board comes. They feel honored that you are there, and they feel recognized that you are there. So make the most of it. Then it's absolutely impossible to get around everywhere. So I'm a real proponent of having what I call professional surveys. So in other words, don't come up with the lead the duck type survey that leads you to the answers you want, but have professionally done surveys of the company that get into every department in the company, and that are done on some regular basis. And that you don't not do it because something weird happened and you say, oh, well, we're going to get weird results because of that. Stick to it. If you're going to do it every year, do it every year. If you're going to do it every 6 months, do it every 6 months. Every 2 years, whatever it is, stick on that and look for your trends and look for your patterns, and make sure it's done with enough granularity that you can see that in all parts of the company. So
you're talking about an employee engagement type of survey?
Employee engagement type survey. Mm-hmm. And the other part of those, a lot of times in any of these types of processes, it's one thing to go and do it. It's another thing to do the follow-up pieces, which is, okay, what was it that we did learn, and what is it that we're going to commit to do about it? And I think the board needs to ask that question and needs to ensure that that piece of it is also happening.
As part of a regular strategy conversation, I would guess?
Either part of strategy. Sometimes it'll come in if the board through the comp committee does a employee development or employee sensing, it might come in there as opposed to the full board. But I think it's something that the full board should be interested in and hear about.
And asking questions about, yeah, versus just the presentation. I forgot to mention that on every table there are cards where you can write questions. We'd love questions from the audience as we go through. So write a question down, just put it up in the air, it'll be collected and brought up to us, and we'll collate that. What about 360s? I know that a couple different experiences this past year where there were 360s done on the management committee, and sometimes the board got to see the details and sometimes they didn't. So I'd be interested in your view, Dwayne, around 360s, and then yours as well, Lynn, in terms of how do you want to use them as a board? How deep of an information do you want to get to see?
I think they're positive to have the 360s, and I've seen them done in a variety of ways where it's just internal, and again, you have to be careful on the process and how the information flows back. I certainly have seen it on the outside where it's been done, and I think there's a lot of good that comes from it. And I'll go back to a personal experience. Company no longer exists, but when I was working at Santa Fe Energy Company, there were 2 or 3 of us that had quote-unquote executive coaches, and we went through the 360 process, and I think it was very good for the individual, but also I think it was very good for, in that full 360, as you went to people that worked for you and who you reported to try and get a better understanding of not only strengths and weaknesses. That's the easy, in some ways, part of it, but in understanding of where the company's going. So the aspect of a 360, the information that's gathered from it, again, if it's done in such a way that ultimately, if it flows to the CEO, the information, it has to be careful. You have to be careful in how that's presented to them. But if it's the 360 around the CEO, in essence, that's a little bit of what Devin certainly does right now. That's a process. With the interviews, that's certainly it. But I see it further down into the management as being very, very positive to be able to obtain that information. And again, it's if it's all done constructively and everybody understands that you're working towards a better company, you're trying to be a better manager yourself, the CEO wants to be a better person or better understanding. If there's some issues, he wants the company to move forward in the right way. If you have that open, constructive dialogue and you're always searching for the best answer for the company, all those processes are quite positive, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. When last May we had Greg Brenneman speak as a panelist here, and he was talking a lot about on the boards that he's served on, they do visits, as you said, Lynn, at different places alone without necessarily the management. He talked about actually moving board meetings around so that it was held in different ways. What are some of the practices that you would suggest to boards about how they can get around to the different locations? I think you travel internationally as well.
Yes.
To do that.
Yeah, one of the things, I think it's better to do it than not to do it. But the reality is when you go to a location and you have your meetings, it's kind of like when you go to a really beautiful city and all you see is the hotel. So I think you have to recognize what you can get out of it and what you can't get out of it. So bottom line, I do recommend doing it, but I think as much for you to, in a sense, recognize the people that are there in the field and what they do, for the company, as it is anything that you're going to glean. If you're an operational type like I am, one of the things you will glean is, okay, how's the housekeeping at this place? Do you see visible evidence that safety performance is important? What other metrics do they have that are quite visible to the entire workforce? So you will learn some things being there. And I think you just have to put it in perspective, because they are going to be probably on their best behavior. I mean, you'd almost hope that they'd be on their best behavior. And your being there is going to perturb a little bit, how things might normally be. But I also, when I go on one of these site visits, if at all possible, I like to come back later and go a little deeper into something that I might have, seen while I was there at a board meeting.
Dwayne, what are your thoughts on
Maybe to add to that, I agree totally what Lynn said, and I'll give, again, 2 examples, maybe at opposite ends of the spectrum. I'll go back to my Dominion days. For those of you that aren't familiar with Dominion, it's the parent company is a very large regulated utility in Virginia, and the oil and gas group, through a variety of mergers, became quite large, and you had deep water assets, $100 million dry hole exposures to, in essence, cost plus on the regulated side. So we took the opportunity of bringing the board members, particularly to the New Orleans office and to the offshore, for them to understand how we were trying to manage risk, how we allocated capital, to give them comfort that although, yes, this is very different to what you're used to from a predictability standpoint, how we allocated capital, how we looked at selling different aspects of the deep water in conjunction with the very large onshore projects, was really to give them comfort around the oil and gas side of it. Now, in hindsight, we maybe gave too much comfort because they wound up selling us because they saw how much money it was worth, and that was fine. They were a great parent. On the other end of the spectrum, the company in Singapore, I'm on the board. We have assets in Gulf of Thailand, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam. So we go to one of those offices exactly for the reason that Lynn said, because you don't get a sense if you're getting a presentation through a PowerPoint presentation and the board asks good questions and they ask about it, you're still getting the filtered response from management in some ways. So when you're out there and you're in Bangladesh and you talk about security, you might get a different answer from the country manager than what you might get as you're having that discussion. So again, it gives a sense of, how long should you be, how should you look at this asset? What are the issues around all the employees, national and the expats that work for you? But by being able to go out in the field, to go to those offices, to discuss one-on-one, whether it's formally in a meeting where you can ask a question or informally later at a dinner or something, I think it helps a board very much understand some of the issues that go through. And again, it's not the board's job, certainly, to manage the company, but it's better if the board has a deeper operational understanding of what's going on. My background's operations, like Lynn too, so I don't do it from a standpoint of why aren't you doing this, but maybe having a better understanding of what are the key issues, what are the implications to what we're doing, how we're allocating capital. So again, I agree totally with Lynn. Those are very important to go to a deeper dive.
And how much time would you estimate outside the normal board meetings you guys have been investing in those kind of meetings?
That's a little hard to answer because sometimes the largest amount of block of time is actually the travel to get there
Yes.
and back. But I would say I probably do 3 off-board meeting type trips a year. And usually one of those is in the United States and 2 of them are outside the United States. And so the ones outside the United States are 3-day events at minimum, and inside is usually a 2-day event, as minimum.
And for me, I do 2 that are outside the norm. But of course, the corporate office for the one office is in Singapore, so that's a long trip, obviously, just to get there. but we go to one of the other offices once a year normally, and then at Devon, once a year we go to the Canadian operations, because again, for those that aren't familiar, Devon has about 135, 140,000 barrels a day of production, mostly in the heavy oil in Canada, so it's a very important part of the company. So we go there once a year and see the people there.
I've done a lot of work on CEO transitions, people being promoted into the CEO through succession or coming in as a new, and almost immediately the thing that we start working on is how to work with the board. And so anytime you have a new CEO coming in, that's a chance, as we talked about, to make adjustments to your process. What advice would you give to new CEOs coming in to how they set up their board assessment process? And what should boards do in that opportunity as well?
Well, particularly for a first-time CEO, I think the main advice is you cannot communicate too much, with your board. And so set up normal channels that include off-board meeting communication. And most boards get antsy with a new CEO if they don't hear something at least monthly. So, do a monthly letter to your board to talk about the business or issues or, whatever you think is important for the board to know off cycle. I would encourage CEOs to talk to individuals on the board, from time to time through a short phone call. Several of the CEOs that I've worked with do that. They'll set up, and it doesn't have to be long, 15 minutes, 30 max. It's amazing what you can cover in 15 minutes if you are very planned about it. So that is for certain. And I think the executive session of the CEO alone with the rest of the board, because most CEOs are also on the board, is a really important time, and one in which it allows the CEO the opportunity to be very balanced about what is going well and what's not going well, and also the opportunity for the CEO to say where they need the board's help. And I think encouraging your CEO to understand that they can ask for help, and that they aren't expected to know everything, sets the right environment for that conversation to be more open.
I agree. I mean, maybe to add to it, I think it depends a little bit on the new CEO. Was he or she internal? Did they come from the outside? Why? Was the company doing very well? And it was an internal candidate. If it was external and the company was doing well, I might add, I think maybe it was a failure on the board and the CEO not to have a strong internal candidate to take over. But if there were issues that the board felt that it was better to have someone from the outside, I agree. Then I think the communication is different in the assessment of directionally, are we going the right way? Are we all in agreement? Comes in the process of a formal communication, even if it's short, and informal. I think sometimes CEOs, and a lot of it is driven a little bit in this day around governance or maybe good practices. They're a little concerned about calling one or two board members and talking to them and saying, we're looking in this direction. We've had some thoughts on doing this. I've been here. I'd like to move in this direction. What are your thoughts? Not that you're giving them advice that that's what you ought to do, but to be able to have just that type of very informal conversation, I think is very good. CEOs are somewhat reluctant to do that because then they worry about, well, if there's 8 board members, then I had a discussion and he heard something the other people didn't. So, but I think, again, and I'm old school on that, I think there's more positive than negative that comes from that. But it truly is the communication, and it is the situation that the particular company is in. And also size of the company makes a difference too, because the bigger the company, the more structure there tends to be around those types of processes.
But in both cases, you guys are saying that the board has to expect to invest time in those conversations offline as well as visits.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say you're not doing part of your job, particularly in a transition.
Yeah.
That's part of a board's responsibility.
We got a question about site visits. So before we leave that topic, I want to go back and the question is, what happens when you go to a site visit and you find something that is not quite right or proper? What do you do? How do you balance oversight with being hands-on?
I've actually had that happen many times, and I don't know that I could say I do it right, but here's what I do. I usually try to find the opportunity to speak with the plant manager privately, indicate to that person what I saw and why it concerned me, and I generally at that point just listen. You know, how are they going to respond to that, and what do they intend to do about it? And if I get the feeling from what they say that, you know, this is going to be, you know, dealt with, I kind of leave it at that. I'm not going to try to tell them what to do. If I don't hear really much of anything coming, then, you know, I might in fact make a few suggestions of things to consider to do. And whoever it is in management who is responsible for that, and I also tell them that, you know, I'm going to have to indicate for higher up, you know, what I saw, so it's not a surprise to them when that person maybe comes back. And I do feel the responsibility for whoever in the senior management is responsible for that area, for them to know, you know, what I saw and to know about the conversation that I had. But I just don't think, particularly if it's a safety item, I just don't think you can look the other way and say, you know, they'll get to it, because if they were going to get to it, they would have gotten to it.
Yeah, totally agree, both on the safety and particularly harassment. I mean, these types of things, if you were doing a tour, whether it's even culturally different, obviously, when you go to Asia, but even if you saw that, those are unacceptable, and I think those are different discussions with the CEO and the other board members. If you're visiting, whether it's a plant, in the case of a service company or something, and you just don't see where management or the next line management seems to be working together, or there seems to be issues around forecasts or snickering. That's a culture issue of what's going on there, and that in some ways maybe is even harder to fix. The safety and the harassment ones in some ways are easy to fix, because you either do it properly or you get people who will. It's as simple as that. There's no gray area. The other one is a deeper problem, because it's endemic then into how people are planning, how they're performing, how they're working with their coworkers, how they're working with their managers, how they're working outside the company, and it's reflecting back on the company. So again, that one is probably a little more difficult to solve.
But certainly, I mean, a board is going to be responsible for things that have gone on, we know now, for a long, long time, not just what you're seeing now. You both are saying that you all are responsible for setting the tone at the top, as the CEO is, in a way.
No, absolutely. And, you know, to me, and it's, you know, obviously in the press with, you know, the Harvey Weinstein issue, quite, you know, just strictly from the outside, the entire board should be fired. I mean, how on earth did you allow, you know, contracts within the HR department that allowed for things like that? I mean, for me personally, it's beyond comprehension that someone could do that, and the board, obviously, or parts of the board were aware of it. So, you know, that is a complete failure of the board, in my opinion, and even other parts of management. I would hope to think that everything within that company there had that total culture. And so, I mean, it is the responsibility of the board ultimately to take that lead in issues like that. They're just, again, there's no gray area in my mind on that.
When you look at CEO review processes, all the information you've gotten, whether it's interviews, 360s, a question from the floor is, how many reviews do you need to have before that are questionable before a board should consider a change?
Ooh, I think you have to take every situation is different, and you have to consider, is this because no human being could perform well in the industry environment, and so is it more an external issue versus the person? I don't know that there's a cut and dried answer to that. I think the bigger problem that I've seen a couple of times is where you have a board that, in a sense, does everything best practice and model. So, they have a very transparent evaluation process, a right balance of metrics. They do 360, they do the interviews, they do self-evaluation. And yet, while it's evident that there are issues, it's sort of like at the end of the day, the person is performing fine and you move on. So you're not willing to act upon those issues, whether it's the first time, second time, third time. It's very, very clear that people are saying, well, we don't really want to deal with this. I think that's the bigger issue. And sometimes I think it takes people coming new onto the board that, are seeing this fresh, aren't as invested in that person. Because, think about it. If a lot of your responsibility of the board is to pick the CEO, and you've picked this person, and so you're sort of invested in this person, and it's not working out, it's harder for you perhaps than someone who comes in who wasn't part of that process and say, now wait a minute, are we really happy with what is happening here? And so I think as a new board member, it's hard to do that because, again, you have not, in a sense, earned your stripe on the board. But it's probably one of the biggest services you can do for a board that has an underperforming CEO. So I know I kind of ducked it on, is it the first, second? I think in general in life, you owe it to people, unless it is so egregious that it's a code of conduct issue and then it's, you're done now, that you need to give a person the opportunity to improve and act upon the feedback that they're getting. So, and we're depending on what the issue is, some things can be fixed rather fast. Some things take some time, even if the person is diligently doing it to turn the ship or turn it around. And you need to think about, have you given them enough time to act upon what you asked them to do?
I agree with Lynn on that. I think each situation will be different. And I'll address upstream because that's where most of my experience comes from. Whether it's a CEO that came from the inside or someone that came from the outside, the quality of the assets are going to dictate a lot of the performance. So in the discussions with the CEO, if you have very weak assets, weak performance may be about what you would expect to come out of it. So you need a lot more. Are you making directional progress? Do you even have the assets that you can fix the problem? What options do you have going forward? If you're then hearing on a 360 where the company or let's say the next level, the senior management, strongly believes that part of the reason we're not having the solutions and not making progress is driven by the CEO, then you've got to take a look at it. But again, I might argue that in many ways that's maybe a little bit failure of the board. They put the wrong person in there too. So it's not just a reflection back on the CEO. You have to take a look at what the board did or recommended or agreed to in that process. So each case is unique, but certainly a company, a CEO that comes in to fix a company, even 2 or 3 years, the results may not be what you would hope for, but you have to look, are you making progress? What were the reasons? If you didn't make progress, what is the strategic plan going forward in the short term and the longer term to get there? And do you believe he or she can do it with the assets or with the people they have? So again, I think each one is very complex. It's not as easy as just saying 2, because, you know, having been a CEO, I would hope I would get more than 2 negative feedbacks to solve the problem. But I don't think it's a numeric thing. It's, again, I think it's dependent on the situation that the company's in.
It shouldn't wait just till the review either. It has to be, as you said, continuous feedback so they know directionally where it's going.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned the job of the board being to choose the CEO, succession planning, and really how a CEO develops his talent is a real indicator on the future of the company and what situation the board's going to be in. Is there a successor? I know that we had talked a lot about experiences that you all had where succession was handled well or not well. Can you maybe speak into that a little bit, an example of how you've handled as a board where you didn't see succession being handled?
Yeah, I'll give an example of where it wasn't being handled. This is a situation where this company was actually doing incredibly well, but there was essentially no succession planning at all, and not for any of the key executive jobs, and certainly not for the CEO job. And so the board, at first, because the company was performing so well, kind of let that go. And then, I suggested that we, probably ought to make it more of a clear expectation that it be part of the CEO's go forward. And the board agreed with that, and the first year that expectation was explicit. When we got to the end of the year, there was nothing that had been done. So in executive session, the board talked about, well, how do we deal with this? Clearly the CEO hasn't heard us. And we decided to put it as a very explicit part of the annual incentive program, with enough weight on it that it would be a pocketbook hit if it was not done. And so the year went by, and we still didn't see anything, and so we actually did dock the AIP for it. This got the person's attention, and as we started tightening up the time frame that we weren't going to wait, another year. We wanted to see something in I think it was the next board meeting we sat. And it was kind of a very non-professional job. And we knew that it was an issue, and so we had started identifying people and interim solutions and so forth, and we ended up doing an interim solution to solve that problem. But I do think sometimes hitting people in the pocketbook with the non-financial measures is the only way to really get their attention if they're not picking it up on their own volition.
And Dwayne, when you are looking at succession planning and beyond the presentations to the board, what is it that you want to see that lets you know that people are actually being developed? Well,
one is the presentations to the board. I know on all the companies, certainly that I've been with board members, we required various people, sometimes 2 or 3 levels down, that were on the succession tree, to give presentations. And to me, it's always interesting, particularly with, I say younger people now, when you see some of the younger managers, one, they're very, very smart, obviously, as in what they do and what technology has allowed them to do. But sometimes as a board member, I'll ask a question to someone young that there's really not a good answer. And you just want to see how they respond. Not that they're going to be defensive to what they present or whatever. You just want to see how they think in a situation like that versus just a process where someone's going through the slide deck, as Lynn had mentioned earlier. So I think that's an important part of it. But it is interesting to see, I think, how certainly in the time that I've been on boards, which is now a little over 10 years, to see how succession planning has both evolved and in some ways been forced by good boards to evolve. Mm-hmm. Because, one small company in particular, they didn't want to have any discussion about succession planning because there was no process for that. They didn't want to. And when it was private, it was fine. As we went public, then it was forced on. And I think even the bigger companies, you look back at certainly 15 or 20 years ago, and it was in many ways the management in some of these companies, it was a little bit too much. They knew each other too well. They had been friends too long, and there was a very strong reluctance to change. I think many good things that have come through compliance and governance issues over the last several years have forced both management and boards to look at those things like succession planning and to make certain that there is a more formal process in an evaluation of not only the people, not only the next level down, but what succession plans do the people beyond that have to go through. So I think those are all good things that have occurred. But I think probably the last thing a brand new CEO wants to talk about is succession planning. But
it is what they should be talking about, though, right?
But it is because
at least crisis stuff.
You do. You get into a crisis or something happens, you have to be able to say who's going to step in the short term and what are your longer term thoughts.
That lets boards know the depth of the talent as well. Absolutely. So if you go beyond that CEO spot and really understand it.
Yeah. Could I make another comment on this? One of the things that I have picked up is we tend to, as a board, concentrate on the top of the house, okay? But if you really want to understand whether you're likely to have internal succession candidates, you need to get into a couple of things about the organizational structure and the culture. So, is this a company in which the division heads, in a sense, are gods, and they get to select all their talent, and they get to decide who moves where, when? Or is there more of an enterprise approach in which HR takes more of a role in talent development and more of a role of saying, these people, in order to have a true development plan that might allow them to get to CEO or to senior management, has the talent owned by the enterprise as opposed to these silos. And if you don't get into that, you'll continually get into the thing of, well, we don't have anybody because nobody has had the development steps they need to be able to get there. And so that's, to me, a big red flag is, if you have a very decentralized and siloed organization structure where the silos own the talent, you are likely never to have internal candidates for these top jobs.
I just haven't had the right experiences across the company. Yeah. We have a question about, is there anything that you would do differently for an external CEO or a big acquisition being integrated?
I'll discuss the acquisition aspect of it. And again, I have to just reflect on the upstream. Certainly at Dominion, we bought a lot of different properties, and in some cases, companies. I think the very first one we bought was companies people will be familiar with, was Louis Dreyfus. The Dreyfus family, the actress, was the granddaughter. She didn't really suffer as an actress when you have Dreyfus as a grandfather. She didn't have to worry as someone else did. But we made it a very critical part, a very key component, because they were a successful company, to integrate several of their very senior people into the management in equal positions to these, I won't call them silos, but as much as operational units that went into it. So I think that's important to do as it relates to integration of buying assets. In a reflection of CEOs, that sometimes, I mean, if you want to take a big step up into a merger, you would hope again that the board of, let's call it the more senior company in the M&A would force that upon management to do.
In retrospect, what are a couple of personal leadership past history flaws of CEOs that we should be looking for that might be a clue to future problems?
To me, too much centralized. When I say power, by definition, the CEO has the power, but how does he utilize that? Again, I can reflect back on working for various companies and working for various individuals, and one person in particular that I have the utmost respect for still and as a friend, in some ways had challenges as a CEO because he was borderline genius. He had all the power, and he didn't allow people to express objectively their opinions back on where we were going. And so, you know, that I think can present a real problem and certainly a red flag for the company. And again, I think sometimes the smaller companies, you can have that. I think in a larger company, whether it's, again, upstream service company, any industry, I think there's a more formal process of seeing things before they would be red flags. And again, hopefully you would see those, you would see that in the board meetings. You could see it in the stress or the strain of the way people maybe presented things. When there was a question to somebody from the executive team, but the CEO always has to answer because he's filtering it. Those are flags you're going to start seeing. So again, you address it. So again, I think it depends again on a little bit on the situation, but you can see those red flags.
To me, the biggest red flags are about, I think the terms of imperial CEOs, but the whole thing about the rules apply to everybody else, but they don't apply to the CEO or the senior management. That to me is the biggest red flag. Whatever the expectation is in an organization around the way costs are treated or the way, any kinds of behaviors, it's got to be the top is the model for what's expected, not the exception for what's expected.
And so are there certain questions you ask to get to that? What is it?
The interesting thing is those things usually become apparent through observation for me, not so much through asking questions.
A question, should the CEO have absolute freedom to fire an executive team member even if the board valued the competency of the individual on the team? What do you think about that, Lynn?
Oh, I think absolutely. If the board puts the CEO into that role, they have to hold the CEO accountable for performance, But they also have to allow the CEO to put together the team that CEO feels they need to be able to execute the strategy and accomplish the goals of the corporation. And, if after they've done that and things aren't going well, then that can become a different conversation. But I think from the get-go, you would just have to, if people are being let go that you maybe wouldn't, as a board member, you have to bite your tongue and allow that person to put their team together to execute what you expect them to do.
I totally agree, and both of us haven't been the CEO and having to make management changes to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish for the company. You can't be told, I want this to happen, but I'm going to tell you with who. So it just doesn't work that way, and the board ultimately has to support the CEO if, again, they want to make some change in the organization from a personnel standpoint.
We have a question for you, Dwayne. How do CEOs manage and preserve culture in event of pressure or freezes of things like defined benefits when there's things going on? How do you manage culture when you're going through difficult times, really, I think is the question.
Well, culture to me, it always starts at the top, and there's different layers of culture in companies. To me, it's does a CEO actually have passion, or is it a job? I mean, there's a lot of people that have become CEOs, particularly coming from the outside and sometimes from the inside, that it's about the job and the title versus the passion of the company. Because there's so many stakeholders in the company. It's not just the shareholders and the bondholders. I mean, it's obviously the employees. We have social responsibilities as individuals and as companies. So there's many aspects of that that come into it. So I think those things are all important for the CEO. In difficult times, you have to lead. I think and I've seen CEOs do this, that if the pool can only be X, I've seen good CEOs take the lead and say, take it out of mine, but I want to protect this next layer of people. Certainly when you're on the compensation committee and you're on the board and you see that, you see what the employee's done. Now, ultimately, because that all gets published, people who read enough into that, deep down into the employee base, will be able to see that. So you have to lead by example in those difficult times, and that sometimes means, if someone's working all night because we have to have the answer, I'll tell you what, there's nothing better than popping in at midnight with some coffee and donuts, because you came back and said, I know you're working on this, and I told you I have to have it, but here, I appreciate it. I mean, there's different ways to show in difficult times that, and part of it is a personal touch, in my opinion.
Today so far we've talked about the role of the board is succession, developing talent, watching how the CEO does that. Culture is a piece. We have a question about assessing the CEO. What is the primary thing you should be looking for? Is it leadership skills, operational expertise, financial expertise? What would you prioritize? Lynn, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's one of those, I always hate to be asked, what's my favorite whatever, because I'm of the camp that believes that there are a number of things that a CEO has to do and is expected to do, and that number probably goes up by the day. And the hard reality is they have to, in a sense, be able to do it all as it relates to the importance of their company. And, it'd be nice to say, well, there's only 2 things or 3 things. I think that is unrealistic. Expectations are high, and the number of skills the person has to have is high. Now, having said that, I think a good CEO understands what they're good at and what they're not good at, and therefore they have a team of people or create a team of people that the team perhaps has everything that's required and shores up the places where an individual may have some shortcomings or gaps. And that there's absolutely no person that I know of that has it all, even though they're expected to have it all. But that doesn't say they can't create it virtually of all with the team that they put together.
Yeah, and to add, I mean, the ultimate person who keeps score is in a public company is the share price. So, and regrettably, a lot of that is driven by the financial, the operational, in where you're going. But I think inside, as a board member, in some ways, assuming that it's all moving in the right direction, those are almost a given. To be able to look at those things, and those are all important. But for me personally, one of the things I always like to look at or try to understand as you go through a discussion with the CEO and some of the senior management is everybody talks about a vision, and I want to be the best in the top one or two or whatever, and I like apple pie and ice cream. I mean, that's nice. To me, it's what is your strategic vision? Mm-hmm. Not so much this esoteric vision, but what is your strategic vision? What's your strategic plan? Each one of those is different, because the vision may be, I want to ultimately, if you're an E&P company, I ultimately want to be only in the Permian, because that's where we're getting the best multiple or the best value in the stock market. But your assets are only 20%. So what is your timing? How are you looking at the assets? How do you think? To me, that's the important part of a board member understanding with the CEO. If you have this strategic vision, is how do you think to get there? Is it even possible to get there? So a lot of those things, the measurement side of it, yes, they're important. Agree totally with Lynn. Some people are stronger, and you default to the things that you're both stronger with and you enjoy. I still like looking at decline curves. They're kind of fascinating to me to look at. So, that's by default to what you do. The rest, you have to be, to me, a CEO's best friend. If there's a chief operating officer, it needs to be the chief operating officer, and probably the CFO and the head of HR. So all in the accounting side. They all work together as a team.
So just our last question as we wrap up, is there anything you'd recommend to all these board members that they should go back and really look at in terms of their own actions or the way they plan for this year with their boards to make sure that they have enough insight to truly assess a CEO?
Well, for me, maybe there's three considerations that you have to take. Is one, it's your obligation. I think certainly board membership responsibilities, you hope would have not changed that dramatically, but I think they have in the last certainly 20 years. So it is your obligation to look at things, not only how's the company doing, but in assessing the CEO and his role as being a CEO. Then you have to have a proper process, and it doesn't have to be, I call it the hard process. I know some companies I saw some questionnaires where, do you rate the CEO 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. I think by the time you're the CEO, I'm not certain a board member can properly differentiate between a 4 or 5 and how people grade and what that means. So the process does have to, revolve around, how's the company doing, all the cultural issues, the things that Lynn mentioned, the leadership, all those things are important. So, but there's a harder process in looking at the numbers. There's a softer process in how is it being accomplished, what is the culture. And then to me, the final thing is clear communication, certainly with the CEO and the other board members, because again, depending how it's structured within the board, sometimes you hear some of the information, or you want to make certain that the other board members are fully appraised with it, and then whether it comes through the lead director or the chairman of the comp or a combination of the two, that communication has to be very clear and concise.
Yeah, I think I'd go back and have a discussion with executive session in the board and say, you know, how satisfied are we with the process that we are using? Are we getting out of that process what we need? And if not, you know, what changes would we make to get there? I think the next thing would be to ask the CEO, is this process effective for you? Are you getting the feedback that you need? Are there changes in it that you would like to see that would make it more effective for you? Take on board those if they, you know, make sense, and then start afresh on your new process. But, you know, I'll go back to what I said, the biggest problem I see is sometimes the best process is not necessarily effectively used because the communication of the real story is not actually communicated to the CEO. And so I think, you know, as a board, you just have to commit to give a balanced picture. You know, this isn't gang up on the CEO, but it's how are you going to ensure that the real messages that need to be heard are heard and that they are delivered.
Great. It's been an honor to be here with you. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your wisdom.
Thanks, Francie.